Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you virtually, and I'm very honored to get this invitation for a keynote. I'm just sorry that I can't be there in person, but I think one of the advantages of the internet access, though it doesn't substitute for in-person interactions, is that one can have a low-carbon interaction. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about building ecologically smart cities and discuss some of my work in Bangalore, looking at the deep ecological history. And let's just get to it. So I'll start with this nightlight satellite image, which many of you must have seen already. If you haven't, it's a very good way to look at urbanization, because the world is experiencing a massive urban transition. And frankly, the only people who leave lights on at night are people in cities. It's a very unsustainable way of living, but we're sort of locked into it in cities for various reasons. But it's a very good proxy to understand the rate of urbanization and the rate of growth. And we're already a world that is 50%, more than 50% urban, but we'll be more than 75% urban by 2050. And I'd like to ask you to look at a little bit of where these bright lights are. Of course, they're in the US and Europe, but you'll also see large parts of East Asia, South Asia, Africa, some parts of Latin America also lit up. Right? And here's another chart that shows you the growth of cities, looking at population data from the UN World Urbanization Prospects. This is a 2014 data, but it will still show you that the largest cities and the fastest growing cities, that is the reds and the yellows, are largely focused in the global south. In fact, I don't know how many of you would know this, but apart from India and China, which are of course the two fastest urbanizing countries, we can also add Nigeria to the list, which is not an urbanized, it's not something we would, if I asked you to close your eyes and come up with a country that defines the word urban, you wouldn't think of Nigeria, but there it is. Right? So the kinds of places in which we are seeing urban growth are very different from the kinds of places we thought of as urban, which is the US and Europe largely, but maybe places like Hong Kong or Tokyo or a few other parts of the world. And in Mexico City, Ibadan, Bombay, these are not cities that people traditionally thought of as constituting the definition of urban. And yet we see that urbanization in these kinds of countries like India or other global south countries is very, very different from global north countries. The sheer density, for one. I mean, as you can see in this image, which is from central Bangalore, you see trees and you will see monkeys and squirrels and crows and sparrows fighting for space along with people and coexisting with people, very interestingly, because if you have this density of people living in the global north, you will find very little nature. Right? And in the global south, you have this density coexisting with nature because it's a different way of developing people-nature relationships, as I'm going to talk about. I'll give you another nightlight satellite image to show you how different parts of India, I'm focusing on India, but in parallel, this kind of stories that I'm going to talk about from Bangalore today would be very parallel to stories from many parts of Africa and many parts of Latin America too, and other parts of Asia. Right? So if you look at this is a nightlight satellite image that's a composite image, an image with data from multiple times, multiple years. And blue is lights on and pink is lights out, which means basically blue is areas where nightlight densities have been growing over the years, and pink is areas where nightlight density has been shrinking over the years. So essentially you're looking at India, which has a lot of expanding cities, and parts of the US, which is former industrial locations of the US, the southwestern US, which have shrinking cities. Europe also, as many of you know very well, has a problem of shrinking cities. And a lot of the literature on urbanization and urban sustainability from Europe will talk as much about shrinking cities and the problems of how to maintain sustainability in the context of shrinking cities as it does about growing cities. But if you look at the global south, the conversations are always about urban density. Now, when did this start? There is a presumption that global south cities have been growing very fast in recent decades, especially. But we did a paper in Nature Sustainability where we looked at the fact the urban south is really hidden in plain sight. And what we show, as you can look at these box and whisker plots, where the blue box is from developing countries or the global south, essentially, and the green is from transition, developed, and the other way around. Sorry, blue box is from developed countries, and the green is from global south or transition, developing, and LDC, least developed countries. You can see that the population growth rates from the 1970s onwards have been much higher in the global south. So people come into global south cities. There's two things going on. There's a lot of endogenous growth. People are people are having larger families in global south cities, but there's also a huge amount of migration into these cities. We also, this is an interesting, I should give you a little bit of an aside into how this process, why we started digging this up. So this is, we wrote this paper and submitted it to Nature Sustainability, talking about the fact that the global south needs a lot of focus. And we got pushback from reviewers who said, show us that global south cities are different from global north cities because we don't think they're that different. So we said, okay, we started looking at UN data sets about the social and environmental context in which urban governance has to take place. And you can look at multiple parameters, whether it's youth unemployment or under 5 mortality rate, poverty rate, slum households, access to water, access to internet, PM10 concentration, which is air pollution, homicide rates, literacy rates. You can see that it's very different from the global south and global north. And in this graph, in fact, we've split up our box and whisker plots. You have the blue again for the developed cities in developed countries. But we've also split up geographically Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And what I want you to see here is not only does the global north have an advantage, largely because of colonial heritage and other historical issues, of having relatively affluent conditions, greater technological access, and access to improved water, sanitation, and infrastructure, but also the rates of access to various urban infrastructure, poverty rates, under 5 mortality rates are very different in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So there's also a geographical variation. One should not lump everything into the global south, and there needs to be very specific regional looks, examinations into this. So I'm from here going to take off into India and India's journey with environmental sustainability, especially urban sustainability. We started by looking at then in this paper the data, looking at the top 1,000 urban sustainability papers from a decade of work, 2008 to 2017, used a number of keywords in Global Scholar and picked up the top 1,000 papers. What I mean by the top 1,000 papers is the top citations. Whichever were the top cited papers, we pulled them out, arguing, and I think very reasonably so, that if these papers are highly cited, they're likely to be very influential in the field. We looked at where the primary author was based. And you see that 70% between North America and Europe, 70% of the primary authors were located in the global south. China is a context of its own. 20% of the papers are on China, but from China by Chinese authors. And the rest, there was 0.5% of the top cited papers on the global south emanated from work done in the global south. I want to emphasize this because really often when you look at urban policy or sustainability, you see approaches like smart cities taken from the global north where they were developed and perhaps run successfully, and then thrown into global south context where you might not have basic sanitation, you might not have road infrastructure, and then you're trying to make cities smart. They don't fit, and they don't fit because we don't have this context. Research was not done in the context. Now, which cities were studied? You can also argue that it is often true that you might have PhD students from the global south going and working in the global north context, and one should not say that therefore these are not papers generated from within the global south. So we looked at which cities were studied. And we found that 50% of these top cited papers were multi-city and global analyses. Of the remaining 51%, 23% were of cities in the global north, largely from the US and Europe, 21% from Chinese cities. And so that leaves only 7% again of the top 1,000 cited papers were from cities in the global south. Contrast this with the fact that most of the urbanization happening now and in the future is and will be from the global south, and we have 7% of the data from it. And so what happens to countries like Hyderabad and cities like Hyderabad and Bangalore or Ibadan or Belém? You simply don't have any understanding of its context. And really, for these cities to be resilient to climate change and to urbanization, you must have planners understanding how life functions in these cities and how ecology manages to thrive and survive in these very, very dense cities. And it does so because there's a dialectic relationship between people and nature. Nature shapes people, people shape nature. So a little very, very short introduction to my own background. I started my PhD work in 1994, looking at forest collective action and polycentric governance. And I worked in Nepal, India, parts of Latin America, Africa, and the US. for many years working with the Ostrom workshop at Indiana University. But in 2006, I moved back to India, and 2003, I moved back to India, but 2006, I got involved as a citizen, not as a scientist, in movements for lake restoration and to protect trees. I wasn't then studying cities, so my forest work I find is very different, and this speaks to the theme of the conference. Personally, since I moved to studying cities as a resident of the city and as an academic who wanted to give information to citizen groups working on restoration and to save trees, and myself, someone who later became involved with these restoration movements and protection movements, I find my academic hat in cities is very different from my academic hat that I use for research in forests. I'm embedded in Bangalore. I'm a citizen of Bangalore. I'm also a researcher of Bangalore. And I use, therefore, diverse methods. GIS and remote sensing is my core, and that speaks to the spatial themes of this conference. But we also do a lot of other things. We use biodiversity and ecosystem services studies. We link this with archival and oral histories. For instance, from songs or less researched areas, because the Global South is extraordinarily data poor in terms of history. Almost nothing is written. So you look at the archives, but you also have to mine oral histories and fables and myths and songs. And I believe a lot in the idea of the commons for urban governance, and especially nested hierarchies, or what Elinor Ostrom called polycentric governance. And we use all of this at Azim Premji University, where I run the School of Climate Change and Sustainability, was a center in our school, to use this for action, research, and communication for urban sustainability. And I'll illustrate this in the rest of my talk with the story of Bangalore, which is the small polygon that you see inside. The entire area is Bangalore. The gray is up to the gray region is the current boundary of Bangalore. But if you look at the small red polygon right in the center, that's the original Bangalore. So history will tell you, conventional Wikipedia history, that the market town of Bangalore was founded in 1537. And there's an especially fascinating myth around the founding. Myth or history, we don't know, because it's so many years before, and I said nothing was written down. That there was a visionary king called Kempegowda who was in the area of Bangalore hunting, and this was a grassland. And he saw what was a sign of bravery, which was a hare chasing a hound. A hare chasing a hound. And you see similar founding myths in, for instance, Rome, definitely many parts of South Asia. It's an unusual sight to see the hunted chasing the hunter normally, right? So the hare chasing the hound, which he interpreted as an auspicious sign, a sign of bravery, and he yoked 4 bullocks to 4 cardinal directions, east, north, south, east, west, on an auspicious day. And where they stopped at the end of the day, that was the boundary of Bangalore. He must no doubt have been a visionary man, but no one can found a city completely on de novo when there's nothing in existence. And in fact, if you look at inscription stones, and you find a lot of inscriptions on copper plates, on stones across various parts of Bangalore, you will see that the area was inhabited well before Kempegowda. It's an unusual city now, because the city is located away from any perennial sources of water. And that's very strange, because we always learn that ancient civilizations grew on the side of water. Bangalore's in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats, which is a hill chain along the west coast of India. It's a semi-arid region. It's largely open, dry, thorny, it's on a plateau, so it's not that hot, but it's very open and dry. And then if you look at it, we have megalithic stone tombs from about 3,000 years ago, saying that this landscape was inhabited at least that far back. We have no idea how these people lived. But from the 6th century onwards, people start coming into villages, and when they establish a village, they typically have a stone inscription or 2 or many, and that gives you some sense of when these landscapes were founded. So I took these stone inscriptions, which have been documented by historians, and I started from chronologically with different dynasties, the Ganga, the Chola, the Hoysala, and the Vijayanagara empires, which is just up to the point that the king founds the official market town of Bangalore, the city of Bangalore. I overlaid these on a digital elevation map. Many of you are probably familiar with this. The black boundary is the outline of the current municipality of Bangalore. And the digital elevation map will show you where there are elevations and where it's flat. And you can see here that the west side is largely flat and open. And in fact, if you go ecologically back in history, you would see that these are the areas where you had grasslands and open areas very suited ecologically for grazing. The east side. The west side is largely undulating, rocky, granite, very thin soil, very barren areas and with a lot of wildlife, not at all suitable to agriculture, mostly suited to pastoralism, where of a kind that where you would leave the herds to graze in the jungle, the thorny jungle, and pick up the cows and the other cattle and goats that you had at the end of the day. So the West is very different ecologically from the East, which is something that Bangalore has forgotten today, but it's something that I realized when looking at ecological history. And therefore, it's not surprising that the early settlers, when they moved into this area, started moving into the East because it's easier to establish settled areas with irrigation and agriculture. And then, so this is the Ganga dynasty. Then you see the Chola dynasty, which came from the 10th to the 12th centuries. And then in the Hoysala dynasty, from the 13th to the 14th centuries, you actually see a burst of growth where the good areas at the east have all been taken. So people start moving further and further westwards. But even here, if you do an analysis, you'll see that they largely tend to settle down in the relatively less steep areas where they can do some agriculture. How do they do this agriculture? Where's the water coming from? Because remember, I said it's semi-arid. And you get a clue if you look at the very first village in this area, which is Hongasandra, established, or at least the first stone tells us that it was established in 1228 CE. Sangra, the part of the name, refers to Samudra. It's a corruption of the Sanskrit word Samudra, which means colloquially ocean today, but actually it's a large body of water. And what they did was to dig up the mud wherever they saw a wetland and create an artificial irrigation tank, which we now call lakes, which soaked up the water and would be available through the year. So these were series of tanks that were constructed hydrologically, and they exploited very deftly, not just in Bangalore, but across all of South India, peninsular South India. These rulers exploited the hydrology and the topography of these areas. So what they did was, let's say a tank like the tank number 11, when it overflowed, water would cascade down to tank number 5 and then tank number 4 and then tank number 1, so that water does not get wasted. It doesn't flood. But when you get a lot of water in a very short amount of time, it actually goes from lake to lake or tank to tank and fills up the entire water supply. And then from there seeps into the ground and increases the groundwater supply, and people would draw water out from wells associated with these tanks during the dry summer months. But there were also fish of certain kinds which were able to survive in very low levels of water, which were protein sources. There were grassy areas. So when the lake dried up, it would become a grassy area, which was used by women for foraging for greens and for cows to graze on. So this was a multi-dimensional area that supplied people with water. And this continues till the Vijayanagara dynasty, which is when it becomes a market town. After that, a number of kings take over. And again, India not being a culture where things are written down, but rather an oral culture, you have to look to oral histories for a while. But what we do find is in the 1640s, a king called Shahji came in and took over, and his poet wrote this poem called Shiva Bharat in the 1670s about Shahji's time in Bangalore in the 1640s. They called it Big Rule, but it gives us a sense again of how ecologically oriented this city was. It resounded with the coos of countless pigeons. It was animated by the calls of peafowl. But coming back to the importance of water for the city teemed with deep lakes. Each house was graced by a well. Fountains gurgled at every square, spouting a fine mist. Trees thick with flowers and shade lined each home garden, and the city was girdled by a bottomless moat glimmering with water, and dotted with countless lakes. And here the Samudra metaphor comes back, each as big as the sea. So these are very large water bodies for the people who lived in the city. There were picturesque parks festooned with creepers swinging gaily in the breeze that all adorned the city. And Shahji, the king, ruled like the Lord Indra in his paradise, enjoying every sport and pastime with his kinsfolk. Right? And if you look at this poem, it gives you the sense that Bangalore was always a garden city. So Bangalore is a city that is called the Garden City of India, very famous for its trees, its bungalows, its lakes, and has changed a lot in the past 15 years because a lot of these trees have been felled, a lot of the parks have been cut down or encroached upon, and a lot of the lakes have been destroyed. But we can get a sense from this deep ecological history that this idea of the garden city was not only post-colonial, but it really extended at least back to the 1640s. So you have a sense of Bangalore, which had its lakes and its trees. And then you have the poem of the 1640s. And then again, we have a period where we have no data. And this is again really one of the challenges of doing ecological history work in the global south. But the British came in 1791 and took over the city from the ruling king Tipu Sultan in the Third Anglo-Mysore War. And of course, one of the first things the British did was to make maps and paintings. And here you see the city again with its lakes. It's so the original city was not where I've drawn the cantonment didn't exist in 1791. The original city was what you see on the west side, which is Pete and Fort. The fort is where the king lived. The Pete is where the people lived. And you can see some trees around. Most of the trees are either clumped because they're in orchards, or they're linear stretches because they're along roadsides. And you will not see any forests in this area because, as I said, it's a semi-arid area. It didn't have too many forests. Or you see around the Pete, to protect the region, you have a thicket of thorny trees, which were to basically protect it from attacks. Right? So that's what you see, a city with trees only around the fort the Pete area as a fortification, or in clumps for orchards, or in these linear stretches along roads. And then you find lakes across the city as more and more people came in. We have stories that say that most of these kings developed more lakes. So this goes on from 1791. And now I'll show you a map in 1888. And what you can see is many, many more lakes because more people have come in, but also many, many more trees. So when the British came in, the British took over Bangalore in 1799 and created a capital city here. And they controlled the cantonment area, whereas the Mysore king controlled the Indian part of the city. So it was an unusual city because it was governed under two jurisdictions, by the king as a princely state, as well as by the British. And what you see, especially in the cantonment area where the British were that they found it too hot. Even though it's on a plateau, like I said, it was too hot for them. And they planted a lot of trees, a lot of exotic trees, because they had a palette of species from across the world. They used an Indian idea of planting flowering trees that were flowering across every season. So in every season, you have beautiful flowering trees. The idea is Ritu Samhara, which is from a very famous Sanskrit poem by Kalidasa, which is, again, an idea that Indian kings had used. And they also started creating more and more lakes across the city to fulfill the needs of people. So this really gives us a sense that if you look at the long ecological history, as more and more people entered the Indian city, they planted more and more trees and they created more and more water bodies. Right? So this, I think, is the first idea that challenges the notion that urbanization and environmental destruction are inevitable. They're not inevitable. It means very often that, especially for a long while, you can manage to keep these two in sync if you plan. And this is the earlier settlers planned this because they knew that without the shade, people couldn't live in the city, and without the water, people would die. Something happened between 1888 and 1891. 3 years of successive drought. So the water in the lakes ran out because there wasn't enough rain to refill them. And also people started increasing, and there were no additional places in the city available anymore to create these water bodies because the city had expanded. There were homes everywhere. And Colonel Sankey, who built the Sankey Lake, actually said in 1890 that this is the last lake that one can create in the city limits. At this point, the Mysore king, who owned half the city, as I told you, was very interested in technology. And he was very much of a modernist king with a modernist vision of those times. So he decided to bring in piped water from the Arkavati River, which is a little bit distant from the city. And it originally was planned only to supplement the water supply of the city. But the British became very interested when they heard about this project. And they asked the Mysore king if he could expand it to cover the entire city, which was largely British, as I said, to cover the entire cantonment areas. And that was a fateful decision for Bangalore. Because as long as they were dependent on the water supply of the city, lakes were protected, lakes were nurtured, they were desilted every year. There was a worship every year when the lake overflowed. There was a worship of the goddess Ganga, which is the water goddess, called Gange Puja. And there was temples to the lake goddess. There was an entire sacrality of seven sisters and one brother of different kinds with this very sacred cosmos. And different villages were interconnected. Each village was the village of one of the sisters, and there would be a festival once in 3 years where the villages would get together and protect the lake and manage it. All of this disappears very shortly after water supply is brought from outside. If you look at the archives, which we did, very, very quickly you start seeing that lakes are no longer places of worship. In fact, during the plague, people start throwing corpses in lakes, which means they're also defiling a sacred place of worship, for instance. And they're talking about these cesspools of waste and areas of malaria, and they start to fill in the lakes. And look at the number of lakes and trees across the city in 1888. And let's look at it in 2015. I'm going back to 1888 now. And you can see a lot of lakes, fewer trees. People continue to plant trees because they needed them for shade. But they slowly started destroying all the lakes, thinking that they're malaria, places of malaria, and valuable sources of land for a growing city. So they became the bus stop, an area for housing colonies, malls, football fields, converted into all kinds of areas. So only one water body now exists from the original set of water bodies in the city, and it's half the size that it used to be, also Lake. Trees continued to be planted till the 1990s, and after that, Bangalore's lost hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands of trees to various infrastructure projects, because now the emphasis is on infrastructure growth and people don't realize the importance of trees, or let's say planners don't realize the importance of trees. So my first point here is that the story of Bangalore challenges the common assumption that we have that urban growth and biodiversity protection can't survive. It's when you break the local loop of dependence on your local ecology, that's when you lead to degeneration. What happens with cities is, especially, I think this is very much so of the 21st century, that you can import resources from anywhere and you can throw your waste anywhere. And because you can import resources from anywhere, you're not limited by the ecology that you degrade locally. And because you can throw your waste out, again, the city is not drowning in its own waste. It makes villages outside deal with its own waste problems. So when you break that local loop of dependence, you lose the traditions of sustainability that were there for centuries before that. In 3 or 4 years, we can see them disappearing moment Bangalore gets imported water. And yet, as I will argue in my next few slides, the city has still a commons feel, a nature and society connection that is very integral to its well-being. And we need to understand how to restore this in a modern city of today. So where's the data? I'm going to talk about 3 stories that come from Bangalore that can give us some directions for the future. The first is the importance of social ecological diversity. If you look at lakes, wooded groves, and other spaces of ecological importance, they were always used in diverse ways by people in the city. For instance, grazers used it to wash their cattle. Dhobis or commercial launderers used it to wash their wash clothes. You'll see wooded groves where people come in and sit for shade. And there are also areas where you have commercially important species like the jamun or the tamarind, which are harvested for fruit and for commercial value. And occasionally, once in 10, 20 years, you will actually harvest a mature tree, which people use for timber and for building something important in the city. And finally, even if the lake dries up, you will always see women foraging from the grounds of from the lake bed, using these wild weeds that they cook with. So yes, lakes are used for recreation, as you will see with these children playing in the lake. But now these days, you mostly restore it for recreation. You forget all these other uses. You also forget the cosmology. These lakes were created, going back to the text of these inscriptions, in 1342 AD, there's an inscription that talks about a woman who put money into the restoration of a lake for the support of animals, cattle, birds, all other living beings, and the service at all times of the goddess Ganga. Another woman restored a lake in order that her husband and other relatives for 21 generations might obtain merit in the afterlife. And another man in order that dharma might be, or righteousness might be to his father. And this gives you a sense of why so wealthy people contributed to lake restoration as something that they do for society, because that was part of what they were supposed to do, to help the rest of the people. And how would you help? By actually protecting the ecology of the place. The city itself, if you look at again, the imagination that they had was very 3-dimensional. I mean, look at any land records today, and you will see any land records, especially in Bangalore or any part of India because of the British legacy, but in all colonial cities with some kind of European colonial heritage, you will see that the land records are very specifically respected to land which is flat and not 3-dimensional. But in every land grant, in every of these one of these stone inscription stones, which are essentially land grant stones, they would describe the village as here. So, for instance, here's one in Kempapura in 1306. We grant with pouring of water as a devadana, for the god, the temple. The village, the tank, and look at how they define the village and the tank. And all the wet and dry lands, that's the irrigated and unirrigated lands, including the wells underground and the trees overground within the 4 boundaries adjoining the village. And this is not unique to this inscription. It comes in repeatedly in inscription after inscription, where people talk about the wells underground, that is the life-giving water below the ground, and the trees overground, which is the life-giving shade above the ground, as part of the survey document. Okay? Something that has completely faded from imaginations today. But our ancestors knew how to think about ecology. So these diverse values for ecosystems and biodiversity have largely faded away. So you used to have wooded streets, which were vibrant with street life. You had bamboo vendors. They were used by people for street vendors. They had fruits. They had shade. They were used by animals. And now you have high-speed roads where trees have been cut down. And this is a loss of life for everybody, not just the street vendors, very importantly, but for everyone. And you largely grow ornamental trees, not the kinds of fruiting trees that supported wildlife and supported people's livelihoods. No sacred uses, for instance. The sacred uses have disappeared from the city. You can see this man worshipping a tree which on his daily work, and this is the kind of sacred trees you had along this road, no longer. You also lose, when you demolish street trees, an intimate association between people and nature. And here are some quotes from a different city in Hyderabad, which a student of mine, Sukanya Basu, had done. And she said, people told her, a few years back, someone came and demolished my house. This is a street vendor from Hyderabad. I and my wife and 3-year-old child lived under the shade of this tree on the road for a week. The tree means a lot to us. Another street vendor said his father used to sell fruit sitting under the same tree, and he could still strongly feel his presence under that tree, so he would never leave that tree. Another woman said she remembered planting and watering the tree back when she was a child, and now she sits under its shade. So lovely, beautiful testimonies like this. And when the tree goes, this is an ecological history gone for them. It's not just with streets and with lakes that you have this intimate connection between people and nature gone. Gardens in Bangalore used to be, or many Indian cities used to be, places not just ornamental, but very important places for the cultivation of different kinds of fruit and some ornamental trees. But now they become purely ornamental. Now look at the parks. You used to have tree areas like this, and now you have completely barren open spaces with landscaped exotic trees. And Bangalore, again, is a semi-dry place. It runs out of water, and water is pumped out from the ground using bowells and tankers, and used to water these grasses, which are not native, which require a lot of pesticides, herbicides. And you can see how the bare patches are showing on the lawn, right? So it's not suited to the native ecology. It's also gated. It's often closed and guarded, and you can only come in the morning and evening. And a lot of the poor are excluded, the grazers, the fishers, people who used to traditionally use it. Even in home gardens, you used to have biodiverse bungalows like this, and a lot of the species were native and planted for human use, beans, medicinal plants, flowers used for worship. And now they moved to apartments with manicured lawns again, and exotic palm species, because Bangalore is trying to imitate California. And California planted their exotic palms because they were trying to imitate the tropics. So we come full circle, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A if you like. But it's truly ironic. Bangalore wants to be the IT city, and instead of keeping its own native plants, it's using the exotic plants that the Silicon Valley in the US imported. Very bad for biodiversity. Where do you find the original biodiversity of Bangalore surviving? Ironically, in the informal settlements, what people call slums. And they have the highest proportion of local species because they're useful to them, because they use them for medicine, because they use them for food. And sacred spaces. Sacred spaces, mosques, churches, temples in India, varieties of sacred spaces are also very resilient. You have feeding of ants in ant hills, protection of bird nests, roosting sites across diverse faiths, and protection of biodiversity. But overall, the city, even when you have restoration, the biodiversity-human relationship has been fragmented, and there's a huge focus on the economic value and a lack of appreciation of the multidimensional value of commons lands, especially the sacred values, the spiritual needs, and the importance for mental, physical health, as well as the role of provisioning services, the importance of these people who extract fish and milk and fodder from this. So many Bangalore restored lakes don't allow you to pluck food or pluck plants and trees. And yet, in a recent paper of ours, we found that a lot of women from low-income families, we interviewed 202 women from low-income families, and they foraged and knew how to forage and purchased 76 different species. Right? So that's our first lesson from Bangalore. What you need to do in cities of the global south is that when you do urban restoration, you must not restore them just in the way that you would restore a lake or a park in the global north, which is an area for recreation, but recognize that these are commons, they have diverse human uses. They're not public goods which are only for recreation and regulating services, and they're not definitely not areas you should privatize with gates, tickets, guards, and looking for return on investments, as often happens. But you must understand all of the range of commons uses, from the sacred and spiritual to the provisioning and the regulating services that are important. The second story that I have, and I'll move a little faster now that because these stories are, I think, fairly obvious, is that India has a lot of migrants moving into cities. And how do you get the migrants involved in getting a sense of place, being involved in placemaking? Because unless they think of the city as theirs, they're not going to be involved in future restoration movements. So we did interviews with about 100 different diverse lake visitors and users. This is with a colleague, Amrita Sen, who is an environmental anthropologist, now at IIT Kharagpur. And we found that different communities have very strong relationships with lakes. For instance, there's a woman below, Dee Bhagyama, who's a child of the lake from the original village community, who has her own relationship. She was baptized to the lake, she says. And there was a mother of a differently abled child. She told us that he comes to the lake and works off his excess energy in the morning before he goes to school. The lake calms him down and makes him happier, and he is much more happy with his day if he starts it at the lake. Corporate employees came with their tea in the evenings to take a break before they dive back into their computer caves. Most beautifully, a transgender person told us that they like to sit in front of the lake at a bench, because if they stand on the road, the police harass them. But if they sit in front of the lake doesn't judge them. You have the workers that you see who are climate refugees from a different part of Karnataka, used to be landed, lost their lands, and they are taking a pay cut. If they work in the construction site, you can see opposite the lake, they would make more money. But just like us, they want their child, and you can see this young boy here, to grow up in a better environment. And they say it's not safe for him to be at the construction site, but they'd rather he be at the side of the lake, which is green. And so each of these different residents has a placemaking connection, which they will never get in a mall or a built space, to the restored lake. And so one of the things we find very important is we need to look at the future. How do Indian cities protect nature in the future? And commons play a very important role in this. And the third, I think we need also, along with this discussion of ecosystem services and human-nature relationships, to look at biodiversity by itself. When you restore urban nature, what is lost and what returns? And we have very little understanding of this. So using eBird data, and eBird data now gives you, because there are a lot of citizen scientists who are entering data on when they go bird watching in the city. We did a study. This is with colleagues from the Nature Conservation Foundation, Ravi Jambekar and Kulbhushan Singh Suryavanshi. We looked at lake area and distance from the city center on birds, and we used distance as a proxy for time. And we found that what happens is, as a lake is restored, it protects a lot of the resident bird species which increase in density. Some of the resident bird species are decreasing, but there's largely because of the way of restoration. These are the ones that nest in the mud banks of the lake. And now these lakes are being restored with concrete and stone pitching and cement. And that's not a place where mud birds can nest. So this is a problem for the resident birds. But more importantly, I direct you to the migratory birds, and you see migratory bird densities are decreasing across the city. And this is a consequence of what's happening outside the cities. If you have lakes protection, or let's take this beyond lakes. If you have places of nature protected in the city, you're going to protect resident bird species, butterfly species, and other local resident species. But there are many migratory species of butterflies, of birds that come from across the many thousands of miles. And because there's also rapid land use change across the country, that is not going to be impacted. You're not going to protect migratory birds merely by restoring urban habitat within the city. You have to do a lot more at the country scale. But this is the first cut. What I'd like to point you to is we don't even have basic information like this. We lack the most basic information on the drivers of urban biodiversity. All of this put together, what do we see? If you look at India's insights from the IPCC Working Group 2 report, you'll see that India is going to be ground zero, one of the countries that's ground zero for urban for climate change, and especially because of urban heat issues and flooding and drought. And yet, when we looked at, this is with a colleague Hita Unnikrishnan, who is now at Warwick, and looking at city adaptation plans in India, we found that nature-based solutions are no doubt very high on the policy agenda, but almost never are local communities solicited. Their involvement is not solicited. There is a lot of talk about equitable solutions for the poor, but hardly any discussion of gender system sensitive solutions. A lot of discussion of concepts like resilience, but almost no strategy that talks about the importance for peri-urban versus rural regions. A lot of technocentrism, which is again the issue that I was pointing to, because a lot of these ideas come from the global north, where there's a focus and a fixation on smart city approaches, and that simply doesn't fly in many locations in India. So how do we put all of this together and build a pluralistic or a polycentric vision of ecological sustainability? And this is a lovely slide by an undergraduate intern who worked with us, Rohit Rao, and his imagination of how you could actually build a city in a global south context, which is integrated with nature, with the pigs and the cows and the street vendors and the skyscrapers and the man taking his baby for a walk and the artist. So we've been doing a lot of work with outreach, and I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A if you'd like, with different books. So for instance, So Many Leaves, Nature in the City, Cities in Canopies. Some of the learnings from here, for instance, with Cities in Canopies that I wrote with my colleague Seema, we found it's very important to integrate art. And again, that speaks very closely to the idea of this conference. But also riddles, proverbs, recipes. So this is a recipe for Ugadi, the New Year pachadi, which is a sweet and sour and bitter recipe that you make with neem flowers, which signals the year ahead that it's sweet, sour, salty, bitter, basically, and spicy. It has all the flavors. And this is a recipe that tells you, if you didn't have the neem tree to give you the bitter flowers, how would you think of the year ahead? Right? And again, with books, this lovely book, So Many Leaves, that we wrote, which is with lovely illustrations by Barka Lohia. And again, we found that leads us to doing nature workshop with children who then paint on these leaves and start looking at them very differently. From here, you can explain mathematics with fractals. You can go to shapes of leaves. You can look at, dichotomous leaves versus monocot leaves with parallel venation and reticulate venation. There's a number of scientific concepts you can look at, but it comes from the art, and the art is important for the emotional connect. Similarly, we did our study on foraging, but we followed that up with a book called Chasing Sopu. Sopu is greens in India, but we had these recipes from these women who generously contributed them to us, the foragers, and we wrote these down in a book, and the book has been very successful. So I'll end with this. I think the challenge for us is science is important, and we think that science is relevant to policy and education. But unless we build in art and outreach, we're not going to get there and build a different imagination of how do we actually restore nature in the city, especially in the global south.